Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hadley German, and I am the Eugene B. Adkins Curator at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art at the University of Oklahoma. While we wait for attendees to join, we'd like to share a brief video of our current exhibition, A Life in Looking, the Creighton Gilbert Collection, with you. This exhibition, curated by two of today's panelists, Dr. Erin Duncan-O'Neill and Dr. Allison Palmer, highlights key works in Creighton Gilbert's collection. We'll look forward to hearing more from Erin and Allison later in today's programs. So enjoy the video. I hope you enjoyed that brief glimpse of A Life in Looking, the Creighton Gilbert Collection. For those of you just joining us, my name is Hadley German. It is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art at the University of Oklahoma. Today's webinar brings together art historians, curators, and students from across the United States to celebrate the life, legacy, and collection of the influential historian of Renaissance art, Dr. Creighton Gilbert. Your cameras and microphones are turned off, but we welcome you to ask questions or post comments to the panelists throughout the webinar today. You may do so by typing into the Q&A box located at the bottom of your Zoom window. Time permitting, our panelists will respond to your questions at the end of the program. Today's webinar will be divided into two parts. First, we'll hear brief presentations from special guests, David Byron and Carmen Bambach. Following their presentations, Carmen and David will be joined by panelists Alexander Nemerov, Erin Duncan-O'Neill, and Allison Palmer. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce you to our first presenter, David Byron. David is a senior software engineer for Byron Technologies and intelligence services provider in Columbia, Maryland. He studied under Professor Creighton Gilbert in Yale's doctoral program in art history from 1995 to 1999. Where he assisted Gilbert with several projects, including a comprehensive bibliography of Gilbert's works. David has written a detailed and compelling, I might add, biographical account of his mentor's first 40 years. We're all in for a treat as David will be sharing with us this afternoon about Creighton Gilbert's life. Welcome, David. I'm going to hand the reins over to you now.
Thank you very much, Hadley. It's my great pleasure to take part today in celebrating Creighton Gilbert and joining you in giving a little bit of time to remembering his distinctive character and his tremendous achievements as an art historian. I'll be asking for slides as we go, so may I have the first? Thank you. So this is a photograph of Creighton when he was 25 years old, a professor at the University of Louisville. And you can see he's riding in high style in his professorial garb with his pipe, his dashing intellectual pose, and his attentive gaze. He relished the role of professor and in his youth was tremendously ambitious. The result of his ambition, his drive, and his goal is that he carved out a niche in art history that was distinctive. And some of his colleagues, friends, and enemies characterized him generally in the same way. And I'll read you a few quotes that try to capture the essence of what that way was. The distinguished art historian Haverkamp Begeman described him as, quote, one of the very few most gifted and creative scholars in the field of the history of Italian Renaissance art, a prodigy. That was then a job recommendation for his position that he assumed later in life at Yale. A second quote from his colleague, the eminent art historian Walter Kahn, described him this way. Know him is saying a lot. I first met and came to know Creighton on a personal basis only following his appointment to Yale. And he was unfailingly courteous, with something of the air of a Southern gentleman, but he was a very private person, totally dedicated to scholarship. He appeared to have no other interests or distractions, and his devotion to his studies over his entire career was total. So that, I think, captures some of the esteem in which he was regarded, and also some of the intensity that he brought to bear on the task of being an art historian. A third quote from Marilynn Ehrenberg-Levin on the occasion of his passing. She pointed out in a discussion of Creighton that there was nothing modest about Creighton, but he was a legendary character and superb, if idiosyncratic, historian of art, and from a very early age. So I think all of these remarks capture that there was something special about him. And my purpose today is twofold: to give to those who are participating today a sense, a feel for the man and his personality, his way of engaging, the shape of his story, and then also to characterize his scholarship in a way that helps us to see what it was that was distinctive and special about his way of thinking. May I have the next slide, please? This outline describes the course of his career, which was a very busy one. And I think it most importantly points out why he was called a prodigy by colleagues. He was born in 1924, and by the age of 14 in 1938, he was already undertaking his undergraduate work. He attended Duke University, where both of his parents were professors. His father of Italian and Renaissance literature, his mother a famed esthetician. And after having attended courses at Duke, he transferred to Johns Hopkins specifically to enjoy the influence of Leonello Venturi, who was stateside, having left Italy in the wake of the rise of Mussolini. And then he completed his undergraduate work at NYU. In 1942, he had an option to go to Harvard, but he decided to stay on at NYU because it had become, in the intervening years during the war, one of the most exciting places that one could possibly be if one were interested in the study of art history, chiefly because of the very large influx of immigrants from Europe, particularly from Germany, great scholars whose reputations and whose works guided the discipline, both in Europe and once they had come to America. He enjoyed particularly studying with Offner, with Krautheimer, with Friedlander, and these were the key figures in his intellectual formation. Of course, Panofsky. it was Kraudheimer in particular who helped him get this job at Emory University. And we can see on the slide the range of places where he worked. I think that of all of them, the four most important are Emory, Brandeis, Queens, and Yale, for this reason, that at Emory, he cut his teeth as a scholar. It was the first place where he had the chance to prove himself and to demonstrate his academic chops. At Brandeis, he was able to branch out into administrative tasks, becoming chair of the department and learning how to run an academic department in the environment in which there were just a small handful, 5 or 6 art historians. Then he challenged himself by taking on the analogous job at Queens College, which was a much larger program with some 65 professors. And there he was able to test his mettle and demonstrate to peers his excellence, not just as an art historian, but as an administrator. As the course of his career unfolded and success built upon success, he enjoyed appointments in a variety of other places, sometimes for summer, sometimes as a visiting scholar. Yale is where he ended up by way of Cornell, where I think, although he was only there for a brief time, he must have enjoyed a certain sentimentality because both of his parents had graduated from there early in the century. At Yale, having proven everything he needed to prove, he then enjoyed a good 20 years plus of exercising his considerable talents on whichever topics and endeavors interested him. This is a dramatically long, rich, and varied art historical career. And it all began at a finishing school in Florence. May I have the next slide? Thank you. This is an image showing a journal that he wrote when he had just finished his primary schooling and was ready to go off to college. He was 12 years old here. And his parents felt that it was important for him to spend a little bit of time in Florence, maturing, engaging in exploration and personal development, learning to interact more with others since he had been so young in the course of his education, even when he was taking courses in the context of his parents' engagement at Duke and Chapel Hill. This reads, Friday the 27th, this is November 1936, and says, this morning in my first art history lesson, my first history of art lesson, Miss Ramarino took me up to San Miniato and told me the various names of the artists. After dinner, we went to the Greek consulate about visas and then to the Medici Chapel, where the wonderful statues of night and day, etc., are in their original setting. What we have here remarkably is the moment that Creighton Gilbert was introduced to the history of art as a discipline. It's a precious artifact in the sense that it captures the very moment that he first became aware that the discipline to which he would dedicate his life was something that one could focus on. Interestingly, he did not immediately become enamored of art history. He thought of himself as a poet. He majored in classics. He only really engaged with art history once he fell under the sway of Leonello Venturi. May I have the next slide, please? Once he discovered that art history was a thing and then found himself at the center of a burgeoning community of scholarship and excitement, he embraced it wholeheartedly. And in the course of doing so, he published journal articles that gave his peers a sort of running commentary on what was happening in art history. In the course of doing that, he made many friends, a certain number of enemies, and stirred up a certain amount of controversy because of both the blunt way that he presented his opinions and also the precision with which he articulated the shortcomings of scholarship in general as he saw it and the particular scholarly achievements of certain other people. In doing this, no one could say that he was being mean, but everyone could feel the sting of his barbs. I think that Walter Kahn captures this aspect of his personality and scholarship quite nicely when he writes, this is quoting Kahn, Walter Kahn, a distinctive trait for which he is best remembered, I think, is the independent spirit and the endearing, if occasionally maddening contrariness, which he inevitably displayed. Now, I call attention to this not because it's a foible that otherwise mars a distinctive and sort of admirable art historical career, but because it's actually an essential characteristic of that art historical career, and understanding the man and why he was both intensely loved by those who loved him and unnerving and sort of intimidating among those who felt the sting of his pen, captures what it is that was special about him, because he was not really engaged as a scholar in the war of personalities, but rather engaged with the issues in such a way that bluntness seemed appropriate as the best weapon. Here's how Creighton Gilbert himself put it. He said, "I have been articulating some ideas of my own about what is going on in art history, and I propose to go into them with a fast bludgeon instead of a rapier, partly because columns are the expected place for pet peeves." And so he was a man of many, many opinions and shared them generously, while all through that same time generating a constant flow of deep, probing, specific, and useful scholarship for the same community that he was addressing. I want to give you an example of the kind of critique that we have in play and the kind of generosity that also characterized him. Because I think if we can summarize him, we can say that he was polite, blunt, odd, but also fair. And we can capture that with two anecdotes. In one article that was a summary and review of an art historical congress that took place in the early 60s, he compared a keynote speech that was given by Sir Kenneth Clark with a keynote speech that was given by Panofsky. And in characterizing Clark, he wrote the following. Sir Kenneth Clark gave a talk called Motives. It turned out to be a proposal to read the history of art in terms of the history of compositional devices, such as mother and child. The talk compared unfavorably in meaningfulness with those pamphlets that the Metropolitan Museum puts out. Now that's a harsh barb aimed at an academic celebrity and really not meant so much as an insult to the person, but to a particular phenomenon. And that was the preoccupation with a kind of art history that didn't challenge the reader, didn't engage the culture, and didn't go into the kinds of complexity and depth for which he praised the other speaker that night, Panofsky. Here's what he says by way of comparison. One difference between Clark and Panofsky was that the former offered a standard after-dinner speech. This is what the people seem to demand and yet find a waste of time. But Panofsky, ignoring the occasion, simply gave a Panofsky lecture. But what he meant by that, of course, was that Panofsky didn't underestimate his audience, but respected them enough to present his scholarship in all of its richness, depth, and complexity. So, summing up, the man himself was challenging. He was not necessarily, he was polite, he was easygoing, but he was intense. And he called the shots as he saw them, whether it was by way of critique or praise. Now, I want to temper that a little bit by pointing out that one of his archenemies in these sorts of academic slap fights, Charles de Tolnay, was very often on the receiving end of his barbs. But in one particular review, Gilbert described Tolnay's latest work as better than the ones that came before. And he said that he was pleased to have the opportunity to say so precisely because he had previously been critical. He was coming close to an apology there, but not with the feeling that he had done wrong, just with the feeling that he was fair enough to acknowledge good achievements when he saw them. May I have the next slide, please? So I've characterized him using the words of others as polite, prodigious, blunt, fair. I think that sometimes he was described as odd or eccentric or difficult to interpret, and this sometimes was the underlying cause of some of the tension that he experienced, and also the underlying spark of some of the fascination that some held him in as they appreciated what a prodigious and distinctive and tremendously energetic person he was. These are his books, 9 of them. And what I'd like to do is characterize his scholarship partly by talking about the kinds of things that he did, but also mainly talking about the issues that mattered to him, which are on display here in a way that I think is useful. In the upper left, we have a book on Michelangelo and one on the poetry of that artist. We have works on individual artworks by Piero and by Fra Angelico. We have, of course, his Italian arts, sources and documents. And then we have the big volumes below. One, a survey of art historical content ranging through the Northern and Southern Renaissance. One, his accumulation of writings on Caravaggio, and one, a study of the chapel in Orvieto. These represent the accumulated study and preoccupation with particular artists and particular issues. But the next slide shows how that preoccupation played out over the course of his career. He has these 9 books, but in addition to them, he managed to generate about 295 additional publications, including articles, reviews, catalogs, various kinds of publications in connection with Festschrift activity, all sorts of things. When you think about that volume over the span of 66 years, it's about a little bit more than a publication every quarter. So the world heard from Creighton Gilbert about once a quarter for 2/3 of a century. And during that time, for more than half a century, he was also teaching constantly, helping people to solidify, clarify, and refine their thinking about very specific kinds of issues. It's a prodigious output, and the things that characterize it are that it's varied, it sometimes focusing on what's important, sometimes focusing on minor things, focusing on large issues, on small trends, whatever interested him, wherever his curiosity took him, that's what he wrote about. May I have the next slide, please? I think the way he thought about art history is captured nicely in this poem that he wrote about the time of that early photograph when he was at Emory University, around 1946. He wrote this, and I'll read it to you. It is a poem to a graduate student with whom he had a relationship that didn't quite work out, but was still in play at this time. And they were apart for Christmas. And here's what he wrote. The holiday only meant, we agreed, a break in the useful routine, and we should be blank without it. But it comes and drags. The work I should do feels heavy. I think it out. I stalk nervously. I crumple it up. And as my feet and my brain circle, the winter with festive masks of hypocritical gaiety has its own layers of agitation and sorrow. I have never had such a windy burial. I admit it. I am the child lost in the snow. And in the indecisive mind, you are growing to be, my darling, a vast and cloudy tumor. When there is no you, my need of you and this sickness supply me swiftly with a deceptive changeling. It lacks character and touch. It abstractly swells to an all-consuming bubble that can be pricked only when I find you. Warm, in the cafeteria, in a striped blouse, and smiling at 2 old ladies. Your real self has small and special traits. It has angles and functions and love. It is not the world soul. And what it will loose upon me is only fragrance. So in this unpublished poem, which in a nutshell is saying, wow, I really miss you. It's tough being away from you at Christmas. two things stand out. First, the awkwardness of the metaphor, you, my love, are a tumor, which has a little bit of the feel of Shakespeare's Sonnet 130, my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun, right? But most importantly, that what he misses in his beloved is specificity, particularity, idiosyncrasy, the odd and small and special traits and angles. And I would like to suggest that this way of thinking about the person to whom he wrote the poem was his way of thinking about art history in general. He was in love with art history, and art history was his life precisely because of its rich analog complexity and all of the nooks and crannies and nuances and angles and intersections. I asked him once who his favorite professors were, who his favorite art historians were, and he named Panofsky, which was perhaps the obvious choice for a relatively Panofskyan scholar, but he also named Meyer Shapiro, whom he loved, with whom he took courses, a couple of courses up at Columbia as a transfer student. And what he loved about Shapiro was the simplicity and clarity with which Shapiro expressed himself while bringing together the particular characteristics of an artwork and the general stylistic trend or content that he was really aiming to address. And I think that Creighton aspired to copy and to embody those values of simple clarity of expression, focus on anything that seems to matter, and then intense dedication to getting to the heart of what it is that seems special to him. May I have the next slide, please? So in summing up, I would like to leave you with some quotes that I think capture how this man thought. Through his time as a child scholar, becoming a graduate student at a young age, and then hurling himself headlong into a discipline where he made friends and enemies and had high drama and low moments and quiet and celebrity and every aspect of the range of experience of a scholar. It all still came down to these three principles. The first principle is captured in the very first quote: scholars tend to be lazy. This was a pet peeve of his because whatever else was true of Mr. Creighton Gilbert, he was not lazy. He would work and follow a footnote and follow the footnote of the footnote and follow it to its source, and then think about whether anyone had made a mistake of interpretation along the way that he could use to either unravel or affirm a line of thought. And then whatever he discovered, that's what he would say was the case. Second, he once said in a course that people always look for what's different or abnormal or surprising, and then they ask, why is it that way? You could even argue that we're doing that right now. What is special about Creighton Gilbert? But he said, I like to look at what's ordinary and ask, why is that way? He followed questions about what we take for granted. He loved the idea of asking the questions that nobody had asked, and many of his most notable articles are articles that take this form. For example, asking the question, when does a man grow old in the Renaissance? We talk about it. What does it mean? How do we know? His intellectual preoccupations really were these. What is it possible to think at any given time, place, and culture? And for example, in discussing Caravaggio, he would often cite Shakespeare because they were near contemporaries. And lines from Shakespeare would show what was epistemically feasible in that culture so that he could then use that to articulate what a given attitude might be. He did this not just in that era, but with medieval, with modern, in fact, one of his more interesting treatments of modern art is an article on Degas, where he asks about the criteria of verifiable excellence. And what he wonders is what it is that we mean when we say that something is good with respect to that artist in particular. And then he generalizes from what he discovers in looking at the evidence. The large quote here, I think, is particularly telling. He says, Mr. Donald Judd says that the museum collection of Chinese art in Kansas City is a foreign art set down in the Midwest, and it's irrelevant, except for its excellence, because even local art, even if it's subpar, is more alive, more authentic somehow. And to this, Creighton said, I would observe that excellence in art is about the only thing that is relevant, and that excellence in art is always contemporary. So he was not very interested in dismissing the past in favor of the living present, but rather in looking to the past and making it alive to the present by carefully articulating its nuances. And then finally, there are other things here, but I think what I'll do is sum up by saying that the words of a particular scholar in reviewing one of his books capture nicely what he was all about. Paul Watson had this to say in his review of Creighton's book, Poets Seeing Artists' Works. Gilbert suggests that the reader will not find here a seamless discourse, indeed no reader will. These studies are all occasional pieces, varied in focus and length, and even in quality. But this volume of essays gains unity from its author's voice and its author's pen, busy now for half a century. Throughout, there is a reasonable and patient attention to the difficulties of sources and documents and poetic texts and images. And all of that happens without stylistic flourishes or ideological posturing. Poet Seeing proceeds instead in a deceptively plain style. Gilbert lays out problems with care and clarity, and hence with concern for his audience. And the arguments gain life from the reader's sense of the author's delighted involvement in the problems that he sets for himself. That's really the kind of person he was, and that's the kind of scholarship that he produced in great profusion. And the reason that I wanted to emphasize that dual focus of the man and his work is that I think that it tells us something important about the eclectic nature of the bequest of the collection that's on display in this exhibition. The curators have done a terrific job of subdividing and taxonomizing the miscellaneous works into thematic slices. But what's so interesting about the collection is that it could be sliced and diced in a number of interesting ways. And if Creighton were here and we were to say, why are these the works that are in your collection? I think that he would probably answer something like this. Those are the ones that I found. And that, I think, is just how he was. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful and a very fascinating look at Gilbert's life and the complexity of his person. I think I'd like now to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Carmen Bambach. Carmen Bambach is curator of drawings and prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. An elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, she is a leading internationally recognized specialist of Italian Renaissance art. She is the author of numerous books, including, most recently, the masterful 4-volume study, Leonardo da Vinci Rediscovered, published by Yale University Press in 2019. In addition, she has authored more than 70 scholarly articles and 10 exhibition catalogs on the Italian Renaissance, including Michelangelo, Divine Draftsman and Designer, which accompanied her 2017 exhibition. Today, we are so fortunate to have Dr. Bambach sharing with us both about Michelangelo and Creighton Gilbert, two figures who have been influential on her truly remarkable career. Welcome, Carmen. It is a real honor to have you speak with us today.
Thank you. I think something's happened here. So it's a real pleasure to be speaking about Creighton today. And David, in his homage, brought so many thoughts and some of them so incredibly touching. I was Creighton Gilbert's student from basically 1982 to 1988, a little before he came to Yale, and I was still an undergraduate. I am eternally grateful for his legacy of teaching, for his publications, for his support of my research, and not least of all, for the innumerable stimulating conversations and shop talks where he actually played the devil's advocate so often in a way that David, I think, really nailed it in describing it. And this rapport continued so many decades after I finished my graduate studies at Yale until his death in 2011. It was my great privilege to sit in his office while I was a graduate student every week for the full 2 hours of his office hours, talking shop. And in a tireless way, Creighton would share some of the finds he did at auction. He also would show me the articles that he was correcting. It was my great pleasure to have seen during the time that I knew Creighton, the proofs for his Michelangelo on and off the ceiling, the Caravaggio and his two cardinals, the Lex Amoris, and so many other things. I was in his seminar when he took us through the analysis of the ancestors of Christ in the Sistine ceiling. And they're just so infinite memories that come to mind. And here, I just wanted to highlight some of the publications. It was really great that David put together the array of the 9 books and mentioned all the myriads of articles that he wrote. In fact, what has been so influential for me, Michelangelo on and off the ceiling, the complete poems and selected letters of Michelangelo. And here you also see my old copy of the Sources and Documents anthology, which has many post-its in which you can see I'm still using and in my teaching right now. And I just also wanted to note what an incredible role model he presented as a scholar. It was pretty clear to me that he was writing about 3 or 4 articles a year. I knew what that productivity relentlessly meant, and also the rigor. So I, of course, in my 4-volume book on Leonardo, I quoted, "When does a man grow old in the Renaissance?" In the Michelangelo book for the Michelangelo draftsman, divine draftsman and designer, I also quoted that since Creighton's example had been Michelangelo and Erasmus. And so I just also wanted to share an anecdote that is about sort of the beginnings of my sort of professional love for Michelangelo and art history. The reason I want to share this anecdote is because I think in a nutshell, it also captures a kind of what really is the proof of the pudding of a great teacher. And that is the ability to be able to see through a student who is very awkward at speaking, a student who has not yet completely mastered English as their second language, and much less writing, and a myriad of things. And so I'm sharing here the first research and the occasion when I met Creighton a little before he came to Yale. I had been working on my senior essay, and having looked at all the drawings by Michelangelo for the Sistine ceiling, I came across the particular sheet that you see here illustrated, the studies for Haman in the Sistine ceiling. And on the right, I am showing you the drawing as it had been published. And in my view, it was published upside down, and it could not possibly be an armpit, as Charles de Tolnay had described. And of course, we know that Creighton liked to needle about Charles de Tolnay in the Corpus dei Disegni. And so here is the article, my first article that I produced. Again, this article went through probably 25 drafts. I had barely finished a senior thesis for college level, so that was my experience writing. And so the findings that I had made really needed processing. There needed to be a structure to the argument. And Creighton, who at that time was the editor-in-chief of the Art Bulletin, was the one who, along with George Hersey, but especially Creighton shepherded my first publication with infinite patience, I must say. And so here you see the 2 pages that were critical about the argument I was presenting in the article. And of course, here on the left-hand page, you see the design that you see in a very fragmentary form. You see it correctly right side up. And then, of course, on the right page, you see the reconstruction I proposed, and proposed very hypothetically that this was a foreshortened head study for the figure of Haman and the punishment of Haman in the Sistine ceiling, and that it was, however, discarded. Well, so I published that article, and there was, of course, research that continued. And in the meantime, I had become also Creighton's graduate student, writing my dissertation on cartoons, so full-scale drawings. And it had been Creighton who encouraged me to do this. And so also the research, of course, on this very sort of fascinating sheet, at least for me, continued. And basically, there were developments by March 1990, and they coincided with the time that the Sistine ceiling was being cleaned between 1984 and 1990. And here you see the view of the scaffolding being used to clean the ceiling. And I will also say that one of Creighton's famous articles was about the reconstruction of the scaffolding for the Sistine ceiling that Michelangelo used. It looked nothing like the one that you see here. And I think here you can also see in this detail on the left, the curvature of the ceiling, and you see the restorers working with all their scientific equipment to do the captures, particularly the diagrams of the giornate, the plaster patches, and all the technical evidence, and also the imaging of the cartoon transfer design techniques. And then on the right, of course, the very famous caricature of Michelangelo painting the ceiling, and of course, standing up, not lying on his back, as the film told us. And here you see the fresco of the punishment of Haman at the point when it was cleaned. So in March 1990, at least the cleaning of the Sistine ceiling, the ceiling part was complete. The Vatican Museums organized a conference a multi-day conference dedicated to the Sistine ceiling. Creighton, of course, was invited to give a very important paper on the ancestors of Christ that Michelangelo painted on the spandrels and on the lunettes. And I had been invited to be just a conversant in the round table. What was really amazing, of course, is that as the equipe of the Vatican Museums, the conservators, were about to start cleaning the Last Judgment, the scaffolding was right underneath where Haman was. And importantly, it was also a moment where by this point, by March 1990, I had been absolutely fascinated by Michelangelo's painting technique, fresco painting technique, the giornate, here you see the diagram of the plaster patches that he could paint each day as the plaster carbonated, the moist plaster carbonates in about 8 hours. So I was just really conversant with all of that and really enjoying the moment also of visiting the scaffolding for the Sistine ceiling. I should say that pretty much from 1986 onward, I was pretty regularly on the cleaning, on the scaffolding of the cleaning of the Sistine. So this was very close to my heart. And here you see one of the other studies for the figure of Haman. And need I also emphasize that the figure of Haman and the punishment of Haman is on a surface that is extremely curving, and it's concave. And importantly, the figure, of course, is a foreshortening that juts forward. And so from the point of view of illusionism, this was really extraordinary. So I brought with me to the conference a transparency of the drawing that you see, especially here on the right. It was a full-scale transparency of this drawing. And basically, I just said to Fabrizio Mancinelli, the late director of the campaign of conservation, and to Creighton when we were at the point visiting the scaffolding, I said, can we, with one of your restorers, can we climb to the ceiling and just indulge me with my transparency, and let's see how that measures up on the actual fresco surface, because I have a sense that it is full scale, because it is a very large design. And it fit perfectly. And this was really extraordinary, because here again, there was a moment where Creighton, the great teacher and supporter, and remember, I was pretty young still in 1990, and here I was with all the bigwigs of Michelangelo studies, and I was only going to be in the round table. So Creighton and Fabrizio Mancinelli decided that I should write up all my findings the night before we could present. And so I wrote it all up and presented it. Creighton beamed baby pretty much as the papa, because basically we sat through that entire conference next to one another and chatting. We went to so many conferences in Europe together. And so it was really a fantastic moment. And had it really not been for Creighton, who supported me from, being a very naive kind of undergraduate still through all this process, really, this is a teacher who actually came through for his student. And my second article was also one where Creighton Gilbert was absolutely decisive. It was about the cartoon, the full-scale drawing for the that is in Capo di Monte in Naples, which is a preparatory full-scale drawing, or scale 1:1 to the detail that you see in the fresco of the crucifixion of St. Peter. So my argument had been basically that Michelangelo intended to paint the crucified St. Peter completely nude. At the time, the figure, of course, had a loincloth. I had seen all the engravings, that all of the contemporary engravings, they all showed the figure nude. And so I suggested this. Creighton, actually, by coincidence, he had enormous files of research with works, photographs of works. He said, I have this copy, this 16th century painted copy of the crucifixion of St. Peter, which is in a private collection in Long Island. And of course, that had St. Peter nude. So it basically proved the argument. And so, 15 years later, when the frescoes in the Paoli Chapel were being cleaned, of course, the loincloth over St. Peter's pubic area was removed. And so the conversation with Creighton about Michelangelo and Michelangelo drawings especially continued. Here, I'm just showing you one of the many publications, one in which he criticized Luitpold Dussler's pretty erratic book on Michelangelo's drawings in 1959. And basically, Creighton had a very sort of nuts and bolts practical point of view. Basically, you have to explain how you make attributions, which was one of the major criticisms. Dussler basically kicked out most of the corpus of attributed drawings to Michelangelo and turned them either apocryphal or just ascribed to Michelangelo. And so just fast forward many years to the time of research for my exhibition, Michelangelo, Divine Draftsman and Designer, at the Metropolitan in 2017. Needless to say that during all those years of preparation for the exhibition, Creighton and what the conversations we had, his publications, the bibliography to the catalog is pretty full with citations and listing of Creighton's publications. All of this felt like a moment when the circle came together in my professional career, and then just thinking back to really the great guardian angel in my work, which Creighton had been. And naturally, there were a number of works that I was fortunate enough to secure for the Metropolitan exhibition, including the sonnet to Giovanni da Pistoia, which of course was part of one of the translated poems in Creighton's as an important anthology on the complete poems and selected letters. What is really extraordinary about his translation of the poetry is that there is a sense of passion that I think, as David read that very private, unpublished poem that Creighton wrote in 1946, that we can, in a sense that kind of passion in the way that he translated Michelangelo's poems. And we can also see why the poetry of Michelangelo had also a particular place in Creighton's scholarship. So Creighton published far and wide about works that were very famous and works that were practically unknown. And one of the works, of course, that was very little known is this madrigal that is today at the Huntington Library in San Marino. And it was one of those sheets with poems and drawings, the drawings that are related to the Last Judgment, that again, it was very important for me to bring them to the exhibition. In fact, the exhibition highlighted a number of anthologies of poetry, including Vittoria Colonna's manuscript of sonnets, which she personally gifted to Michelangelo. So the exhibition also had the actual objects, the poetry and the drawings together, something that Michelangelo thought of in a very homogeneous, continuous way and complementary way, and something that was very important for Creighton's own scholarship and way of thinking. My favorite, of course, of his publications is probably Text and Context of the Medici Chapel. And in this article, which I am showing you purposefully as a screenshot out of Regesta Imperii, the Akademie der Wissenschaft for the University of Mainz, which has all these links to the publications, to the articles of Creighton. Now, as Anglo-American scholars, we tend to reach out for JSTOR to follow up on research and follow up the links in order to read particularly essays and scholarly articles in certain journals. But this is also a way, by showing you the Regesta Imperii, to show you the extraordinary respect that Creighton commanded internationally. We can do the same thing with the OPAC, or the OPAC online digital website for the German institutes, the Kunsthistorisches Institute, and the other German, the Max Planck platform. So this international presence was really quite extraordinary. So when, again, for the Michelangelo exhibition and in bringing together the studies for the Medici tombs in particular, Creighton's extraordinary essay about text and context in the Medici Chapel was very much on my mind. And one of the really revolutionary aspects in the way that he reinterpreted the Medici Chapel, because there are many other levels at which that he discussed in this article, but the one that really struck me in an especially powerful way is the way in which he read the Medici Chapel with a view of how the spectator, how we, in other words, in a sense, complete and interact with the sculptures in this fantastic and funerary chapel. And his point had been that the figures of the dukes, Lorenzo and Giuliano, have pupils that have no irises. In other words, they are blind. Creighton figured out which was the original entrance to the chapel. And his point was that because these figures were blind, they were dead, but that they hear the spectator entering the chapel. And that's why they turn their heads towards us as we enter towards the entrance in the chapel. So it was a pretty arresting way of looking at a monument in a way that it is alive. And of course, I'm not being very eloquent in describing this, but it is something that hit me very profoundly in my own way of thinking about Michelangelo. It was about the power of the object, the monumentality of the works, the unfinished. And so Creighton and I had many conversations about Michelangelo's non finito, his unfinished. And here you see one of the sort of later articles he wrote. I was fortunate enough to have also heard this as a talk when he gave it in New York. And so the non finito of Michelangelo seemed to me one of the most fundamental things to also present in the exhibition, Michelangelo, Divine Draftsman and Designer. And of course, the sculpture of David Apollo for Baccio Valori, and also the unfinished marble bust of Brutus were the two works in the exhibition that very sort of beautifully fleshed out this other aspect of the non finito, which in many ways is also what is in great conversation with drawings, because most of the drawings, after all, are sketches. And so the idea of sketching on marble, sketching on the piece of paper are in many ways, integrated ways of expression. And of course, it was my great pleasure to be able to bring the monumental cartoon for the crucifixion of St. Peter, the cartoon that had been the subject of my second article that Creighton had so kindly and so sagely advised and supported me. And of course, it is a work that, although more than 2 meters, 2.5 meters tall, the cartoon, the full-scale drawing, it's just but a fraction of the actual fresco for which it was preparatory. And so in the exhibition, it was really important to be able to also, in a way, evoke the monumentality of Michelangelo's art. And this is why this particular cartoon was so important. And here you see it in the installation with the drawings that in small scale that are related to give you just some small semblance of that monumentality. And of course, that is what the public sees in an exhibition. And I can't tell you what an amazing process it is to actually sort of do the work behind the scenes. I mean, here, in a way, this installation photo where my colleagues at the Metropolitan were just heroic in mounting the exhibition physically. Remember that this object, the cartoon, weighs more than 600 pounds. So there were even many more people hoping to be able to bolt it to the wall. And in many ways, this is a metaphor for that process of research, that the kinds of conversation. And the exhibition made me reflect so much about what an extraordinary inspiration Creighton was to me as a teacher, this teacher who had such tremendous faith in all his students, because in many of our conversations, he shared the joy that he felt in his students, what his students were doing, what his students were thinking. And so it was very much about this legacy of the teacher, not just the brilliant scholar who produced so many books. It's that legacy of Creighton the teacher that in many ways is what I carry so closely in my heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. That was so eloquent, so well said. I think that we would probably all agree that Creighton is still beaming at you today.
Oh, he's at all of us being and celebrating him. It's great.
That was a touching tribute, not only to his career, but a really nice look at your own career as well, which I think is remarkable. It's my pleasure now to invite our additional panelists to the screen, and I will introduce the three of them to you. First, a prolific writer and influential historian of American art, Dr. Alexander Nemerov, is the author most recently of Fierce Poise, Helen Frankenthaler and the 1950s New York. He is the Carl and Marilynn Thoma Provostial Professor of Arts and Humanities at Stanford University. In 1992, he received his PhD in the history of art from Yale University, where he took courses with Creighton Gilbert. Welcome, Alex. Thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here, yes.
Welcome also to Erin Duncan-O'Neill. Dr. O'Neill is an assistant professor at the University of Oklahoma, specializing in 19th century European art, with a focus on the art and visual culture of France, from the July monarchy to the Paris Commune. She is particularly interested in politics and censorship in art, media studies, and philosophies of labor and identity. Her current book project traces the influence of literary and theatrical satire in the work of Honoré Daumier. Welcome, Erin. Last but not least, welcome to Dr. Allison Lee Palmer. Dr. Palmer is a professor at the University of Oklahoma, specializing in Renaissance and Baroque European art. Her research focuses on the Italian Renaissance with a special interest in the confluence of science and art in the work of Leonardo da Vinci. She also teaches for OU's Summer in Arezzo program and is currently completing an article on the Quattrocento funerary monument of San Columbano in Bobbio. What a thrill to have all five of you on hand to discuss Creighton Gilbert, his collection and legacy today. I think to get us started, I would first like to ask Alex a question. Alex, you studied with Creighton Gilbert in the early 1990s and more recently served as the executor of his estate. What was it like to go into Creighton's apartment in West Haven, Connecticut, and to see this collection there?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Hadley. I think it underscores something that Carmen and David have spoken about in their beautiful presentations, their tributes, which is the privacy of the man. So to put it another way, I had no idea. And just to sketch in a little bit more, I mean, Creighton's apartment, because that's what it was, or condominium, if you like, was very modest. So for those of us listening in today who are forming a conception, which is not wrong, of a grand man of the Renaissance who must have lived in a veritable palace, let's say, or at least country retreat, I can assure you that that was not the case. I think David's point about quoting Walter Kahn, that Creighton lived for scholarship, was borne out in his place of residence. So that's what stands out. It was wall to wall with art, the very art that has been so beautifully presented in the show. And it was, in effect, a working scholar's space through and through, almost monastic, really, in that way.
Mm-hmm.
May I add one comment to that? From Creighton's book, The Complete Poems and Selected Letters of Michelangelo, in his foreword, he says this about Michelangelo. Michelangelo's dissatisfaction with people led him to live much alone, with little social activity, concentrating on his work, and apparently surrounded by litter which he usually ignored, but sometimes found depressing. This is just one of the many, many ways in which I think Michelangelo as a personal archetype really resonates through Creighton's own practice. because Creighton was most at home, I think, with his books.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, David. Yes, that not only with respect to Creighton, but also with respect to who art historians are, or what they are, which is to say, I think they become melded consciously or unconsciously with those artists that they wish to study. And in the example of Carmen's perfect fit for her cartoon, I think that's almost a metaphor for how a scholar's conception and the artist's practice can sometimes, in the most beautiful instances, come exactly together.
I understand that Eric Lee, who's the director of the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, and another advisee of Creighton might be on the call today. Eric, if you'd like to join this conversation, I'd welcome you to do that as well. Carmen, you said that you were in touch with Creighton through 2011, and I wonder if you saw this collection in his home as well.
No, okay, and this is great that Alex and David have touched on Creighton's privacy. Creighton, I would say, was secretive, as was Michelangelo, by the way, molto segreto. And the works that I always saw were in his office. And he would just sort of pull them out where they might be leaning against the wall. So the last time that I actually saw one of his works, because remember that I got to see him usually when he was in New York, he had an apartment in the Upper West Side, a few blocks away from me. So, and that was basically a basement apartment, studio apartment. So it had nothing in it. So the last time that I saw his works were leaning in his office in the High Street building when that used to have the offices. So that's a long time ago.
Wow. And he didn't, I gather that he didn't teach from his collection. That was really for him.
No, it's actually interesting. He not only didn't teach from the collection, he also didn't use it in the sense that a traditional collector might use it as a collection of things to display to himself for his own pleasure or satisfaction. Rather, he kept them tucked away, either in a box or, as was just pointed out, against a wall, because for him, they weren't really about his role as an appreciator of the art, but they were tokens of his deep, deep understanding of what they might signify, or in the case of many of the items in the collection now on display, what their use might be in teaching some specific point about the state of a print, for example, or the ways that we can think about how a particular painting fits into its context. So I think he always collected with an eye toward teaching, and that makes it ironic that he didn't really teach from those. I imagine that probably has to do with the fact that he had the Yale University Art Gallery at his fingertips and the Jarvis collection in particular, for just that sort of exercise.
Well, I wonder, actually, maybe Allison and Erin might be able to weigh in on this a little bit as well. It puts me in mind of something we thought about as the exhibition was developing, which was that these objects were points of investigation for Gilbert, that he, yeah, and I wonder if you might comment on that, that they were places for him to start research or to enjoy the process of research.
One of the things is, excuse me for jumping in.
Oh no, jump in.
That many times when I saw things leaning against the wall, the first thing he would do is we would play attribution. And so that was one of the major things. He was buying, especially for the paintings, anything from the manuscript illumination to anything, say, into 1700. He was buying things essentially anonymous in order to be able to attribute them.
Yes, and that's what I found as we went through and looked at the labels, and we were thinking about the attributions, and I found that just fascinating, just kind of tracing his logic and his ideas for who he thought created these works. And even the titles, many weren't even, fully defined until we started to look at his own notes and things like that. And he seemed to have a real interest in these in Northern Italian works, like the Callisto Piazza, which you see at the far end of the gallery in this slide. We made that as kind of a high point, and that's one of the paintings that's in the museum sort of permanently outside of this exhibition. It's on permanent display, but we put it right there, and it's just a fantastic piece. And in doing some research on Callisto Piazza myself, I found a work in Brescia that has a frame that is very similar to this reproduction frame. And so even the frame, when it was added to this painting, is really fantastic and fits exactly with the time period, 1520s, of this work in particular.
Creighton's dissertation was on Savoldo, on the paintings of Savoldo, and he continued to think about Lombard painting, and he also was incredibly interested in Ferrari's painting. These were the areas of Italian painting that traditional Anglo-American scholars did not pay much attention. And I would say that at that point, one of the big influences on him here was Leonello Puppi. And so his love for the lesser explored Italian masters was lifelong. And then finally, he actually had the Savoldo dissertation published as a book. I mean, it was even after I left graduate school. I'm not really remembering exactly when, but it was in the 90s. He had it revised and published. So Savoldo was close to his heart for an entire lifetime.
Exactly. Yeah, his collection of Venetian artists and artists from Brescia and Cremona as well.
Yes.
So
the very first course that I took with him was an exploration of Caravaggio and his antecedents. Now, the normal way to look at Caravaggio is with his profusion of followers and how consequential he was. But what interested Creighton especially was not those consequences of that art, but where it came from. And he was interested in the tension between Longhi's thesis that Caravaggio could be traced back to all of the Northern Italians, a thesis that Creighton felt Longhi had really over-argued, and the opposite thesis, which was that somehow Caravaggio burst forth fully formed from the head of Zeus without any roots whatsoever. And he liked to navigate between those extremes. And so the course was dedicated to this issue of which Northern Italian artists of the second or third tier might have had some influence on Caravaggio in his formation or his explorations. And how can we, and most importantly, how can we tell? And the course unfolded in terms of looking at specific candidates for influence and then trying to answer the epistemic question. What would we have to know to be able to say whether that was a source or not? And what was so interesting was that he didn't want to over-argue the case, but he really wanted to aim for the truth, even when the truth was disappointing. And so he would dismiss as many as he would accept. And it reminds me of one of the quotes that was on my final slide, but that I didn't address, where he says this, and I just love this, it's so Creighton-esque. It is harmless and even interesting when one is attracted by a certain kind of art to explore its less successful phases. Nothing could be more true to his sensibility than to say that while we pay attention to the celebrity artists, we should also look at what else happened and follow our instincts and whims, because it all forms one fabric and it's never quite as neat and clean and determined as a simplified version might suggest.
I think that brings up a kind of the complexity, the fabric that you're discussing kind of is reflected in his collection as well, which is, I mean, I would really like Allison and Erin to take a minute to describe how they curated this exhibition. They had to select from 273 objects, and obviously there are not that many objects in this show. So what themes did you focus on, Erin and Allison? What challenges or joys did you experience working with this collection? And then I think we should circle back to this idea of Creighton's teaching afterwards that David's brought up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, as David said, there were a few ways we could have broken this down. The objects were really compelling and really diverse. And so we did these thematic sections, picturing Catholicism, explorations of religion, architecture and nature, allegory, portraits, and humor. So just a really broad selection of themes. And these are from sort of all over Europe. They don't just reflect his interest in the Italian Renaissance, but they often intersect with that interest. For instance, the section on humor, some of the origins of caricature emerged in right after the Italian Renaissance, sort of a new exploration of naturalism by Carracci and his followers. And you can see this very strange copy after a Carracci painting that I think we love from the collection. And one thing that was nice, Allison can elaborate a little bit, but that we found, again, we had access not to Creighton himself, but to his writings. And we found one exhibition review that he had made from a show from artworks from the Vatican in 1982. And it really sort of dovetails with the organization of this exhibition. He preferred, at least he said in this review, a thematic organization of works. He really appreciated sort of breathing space around artworks so that they can be better appreciated. And he admired the inclusion of information about acquisition, so the kind of life of the object after its production. And so I think in that way, it was really nice to honor his sort of preferences.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And with the labels that we wrote, they're lengthier than labels normally are in museums because we wanted to include his scholarship and how his own research dovetailed with the attributions and so forth. So we had these sort of two themes going, one, a very traditional kind of format of thematic approach to his collection, but also this sort of secondary theme of how he himself used this collection as his own sort of private research project, I guess you could say. So
that's wonderful that you deliberately lengthened the explanatory placards that accompany the artworks, because that's exactly the sort of thing that he prescribed in his writings about museology. He really wanted to labor against the idea that things should be watered down and then people should be left to their own devices. Rather, he wanted art historians to be as intense in their focus and thoroughness as primary researchers in the sciences, but then have the museum be a mediating institution that makes accessible the fruits of that labor in a way that people can receive and digest. And his chief focus there was precisely on having richer, more useful captions.
Right. And that also brings up the idea of the conservation of these works, because many of these works went through a whole process of conservation. And we have one painting where we have also on display part of the conservation report and some of the x-rays, because we thought, you know, this is a university. And so we want students to come in from the sciences, look at these reports. And we also have highlighted a musical piece as well with an additional label referencing that. But I do think the conservation reports and the framing of the works, replica frames that were made specifically for these works, we wanted to highlight those aspects as well, since the bequest came with funding to get a lot of that completed too. We wanted that to be part of the exhibition. So I think the conservation reports are really fascinating to read through.
And I might add
Many of
Sorry.
Many of the conservation reports, because Creighton almost exclusively bought at auction. The paintings come with the conservation reports, and he was very careful to look at those conservation reports before actually acquiring. So yeah, the conservation reports were really, really important. It's kind of interesting how he went about buying things. I mean, at least to speak about the paintings, that it was only at auction, not from private dealers. You may want to correct me if I'm wrong, but from the sense that I always got, it was, oh, I've been to Christie's. I mean, and that's what we would discuss. And this would be the reason he would come to New York. Oh, I went to Sotheby's.
That's wonderful. I wouldn't correct that at all, but I would supplement it with one little anecdote he told me. And now I can no longer remember precisely which work it was. I think the name Pontormo may have passed through it during that conversation, but there was one print that he told me about once that he had found in a bookstall while he was flipping through postcards and miscellaneous prints. And he said, can you believe that this was just in a stall by the street? And so once in a while, you just never know where you might find something.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add that I believe the conservator of these works is on the Zoom call in attendance, Peter. And Peter, if you want to join the conversation, please feel free to unmute yourself. And also Eric Lee, director at the Kimball, is in the call. And Eric, if you would like to unmute yourself and talk about your role in bringing this collection to Oklahoma, we'd be happy to hear from you. But in the meantime, I wanted to ask also, several of you knew Gilbert personally or in the classroom, and I wondered if there were specific objects that attracted him or thwarted him, either as a collector, so that's one part of the question, but also maybe objects that he took particular delight in discussing in class. I think, yeah, that's something that might be interesting to hear from all of you.
I can tell you just a couple of stories, maybe also by way of making a larger point about, I think, what Creighton stood for and how he fit in or did not fit in into the teaching world of the 1980s and early 90s when I was at Yale. So I have a very distinctive memory of him teaching a Renaissance art lecture course for undergraduates that I audited my first year in grad school in the old Street Hall, room 268. And there was a gentleman who was a student carrying on to a young woman about the inaccuracies. You could hear him talking in Leonardo's Lady with an Ermine. And it had to do with the hand, and Creighton, the hand was too big, and Creighton finally stopped his lecture and asked the student point blank what the problem was, what the issue was. And then Creighton came back the next lecture and did a more or less forensic demonstration of the clinical perceptual accuracy of the size of the hand in that painting. I could tell other stories like that, but I think the point here more broadly has to do with truth, that Creighton really worked, as I think we've heard today, in the name of the correct answer. And that made him, I think, wonderfully anomalous in the world of Yale in the late 1980s, which was very much of a deconstructive culture. And for me as a student to learn from Creighton Gilbert, but also to learn from people who were thinking precisely not like him, I think was a boon. One just last anecdote here that I think illustrates Creighton's polymathic nature as well as something else about truth is I once was at a party in Connecticut many years later. I think it was a wedding reception, and I was talking to a guy there, and he asked me what I do, and I said I'm an art historian, and he said, oh, I knew an art historian once. And I said, oh, really? And he said, yeah, I used to work as a bartender on Chapel Street in New Haven. And there was a guy who would come in every evening or every other evening about such and such a time. And we always had Jeopardy on the TV. And this guy And it became apparent that it was Creighton Gilbert. He didn't know who he was, but I could tell. This guy was legendary in the bar because he knew everything. And he would also always buy not one, but 2 Rolling Rock beers and charge them on his credit card for a grand total of $3.98. That was the other thing that the guy remembered without fail. So Creighton and truth, Jeopardy, there's a correct answer. That's it, right? So I would even say the poetics of the correct answer is what we've heard about today. And I think there is such a thing. And I think one of the finest aspects of art history is its capacity to just, mesh the cartoon with the fresco and just say, well, there it is, right? It's not the only fine thing about art history, but it is one of the finest.
Mm-hmm.
That is wonderful. So part of the bequest from Creighton to the museum was, of course, this wonderful collection of artifacts, but part of it also was his box of papers. And one of those papers is a letter that makes reference to the fact that at the early College Art Association meetings, people used to stand in the hallway in between sessions and play Stump Creighton. And that was a fond memory for some, I think. Because
no, he was a know-it-all.
And
this was part of the antagonism that he had actually with certain scholars of Italian Renaissance. I mean, Creighton wrote a truly sort of searing review of John Pope Hennessy's book on the portrait and the Renaissance. And, this caused such a rift. Not only the Pope would not, direct his face or acknowledge Creighton, but all of the curators at the Met, where I then was a curator, they would just say, here's your Creighton. Oh, your Creighton, because all those reviews of exhibitions that you did not name the institution, they were all the Met and they were all critical. But he would also, he had it in for Frederick Hart,
he did.
And for John Pope Hennessy, and it was to death and until death.
He really delighted in pulling John Pope Hennessy's chain, and there are many, many published examples of this. I can think of one where he says, as a scholar of the details of such and such a century or domain, John Pope Hennessy makes a fine museum man. And what he meant by that, of course, was that he was a docent in terms of his level of thinking. And nothing against docents, because I love docents, and docents are vitally important. But in that context, Creighton meant that as a jab, precisely because John Pope Hennessy was putting himself forward as so much more. There's another, actually, there's a review that he wrote of one of John Pope Hennessy's surveys of Italian sculpture, in which he says the beginning of the survey is a really beautiful and original statement of something about Michelangelo, which is nearly miraculous, given how much has already been said about Michelangelo. And the other end of it is a shorter but also quite reliable summary of Bernini. And the middle is a catenary curve.
That is Creighton.
So you're right. He definitely took aim at some, and some he papered it over, and some he didn't. But what's really interesting is that while some continued to hold it against him, and that just added to sort of the back and forth of art historical culture, there were those also with whom the grudging mutual respect was still a factor.
Yes.
And without naming names, I can say that in the collection that the museum now holds is a note. Creighton would send out a lot of off-prints whenever he published a major article so that people could have awareness of his latest work and potentially interact with him. And then he kept track of who interacted with him. And one such scholar replied to him with a brief note that said, I just want to tell you that the latest thing that you sent is wonderful. It may not matter to you that I'm the one saying it, but there it is. Yeah, so even in the midst of those kinds of conflicts, which were so colorful, I think that there were those who were, I think, attuned enough to realize that except in rare cases, it wasn't personal.
Yeah, no, but to be fair, because I had been so taken aback by this acrimony, really, with Pope Hennessy, that I decided I was going to read and reread that review. And to be completely honest, Creighton didn't say anything that was, an attack.
Yeah.
He was very objective. The thing was that Pope Hennessy he believed in the infallibility of the Pope. And and Creighton, the fact that he would not sugarcoat when he said things that were true and factual, that is the part that really got some people, just got under their skin. But Pope Hennessy just detested the fact that Creighton could be right.
Alex, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, just, I suppose, a question for Carmen and David above all, but really for everyone, which is just in light of this idea about logic and truth and, the infallibility of Creighton in assailing the infallibility would be of those with whom he didn't agree. I just wonder if you feel there's something uncanny about an intelligence like that. That we can, of course, find terms for it. He was a scholar, he was learned, he was an expert, he was not lazy, but, there is something almost unnerving about a mind like that. So I myself have never really thought of Creighton in those terms, but maybe those terms are apt. I don't know what you think.
Well, I think that certainly if we seek to explain the kind of mind he was, partly it had to do with his prodigious origins, a very precocious child who was really given all the support a child could possibly have from his two professorial parents in taking a jump ahead academically. And he really embraced that opportunity full bore and never really let go of that. At the same time, he had no family to speak of and no outside obligations. So one thing that we can notice is that most people who engage in scholarship, and perhaps some of those, not all, but perhaps some of those that he would have deemed lazy, simply had lives that were more complex than his and obligations that did not allow them to pursue as relentlessly as he was willing to the very, very farthest reaches of a question. And so he came to the table better armed than some because he had the time to do it. That's part of it, I think. But then also an aspect of it that you really, I think, characterized correctly, and as did Carmen, is that whereas most scholars, I think, engaged in the profession in weighing bluntness versus diplomacy, tend to soften the edges of their bluntness in order to engage in diplomacy for the sake of collegiality. And because he was so focused on the correct answer, as you pointed out, I think he did the inverse. He shaved the edges of friendship and camaraderie to some extent in order to, and he was willing to pay that price in order to say what he saw as clearly as he could, because the thing that was his highest value was precision. And it's not the case that he was always right. There are those critics who, if one reads the reviews of him, people who took on the task of reviewing a Creighton Gilbert work were very often at pains to try to catch him out wherever he had overlooked something, precisely because he was this way. And however they may have thought about that, I can't imagine that anything would have delighted him more, because that's the game he wanted to be playing. And it's really the game. He would have said, I think, that scholarship is not beanbag. And in saying that, he would have taken it perhaps with a little bit more seriousness and intensity than some of his colleagues were comfortable with.
Carmen, did you have something you wanted to add? There's a comment from an attendee that I want to read, but first I want to make sure.
I'll go for the attendee.
Well, I think that we don't have a lot of time left, so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about his teaching, ways that Gilbert influenced your own work as teachers or lecturers. And I think probably this would be a nice time to bring up this comment. This is from James Schulman from Art Store, and he says he has two lasting impressions of Gilbert. One, that he taught me that that it is good work, not a failure, to conclude that there's not enough evidence to support a thesis that one is testing. 2, I remember his showing how manorists weren't being strange, but actually capturing the odd perspectives on life that are captured by a sharp eye in a moment. And of course, we see this in photography all the time. Was that an argument that he wrote up at some point? That's the end of the comment. And one of you could answer that question better than I can, but I think that that comment about that there's not enough evidence to support a thesis that one is testing, that it's not a failure, I think speaks to this very conversation that you're having right now.
One of the reasons that he liked he certainly asked me many times to play devil's advocate. And that was really more the way in which we engaged. I didn't really, I regret that, Alex, that I can't answer or comment on what you had asked. I just never paused to think about his mechanism of thinking. It was always about the conversation at hand and the testing of the hypothesis at hand. And so that was more the interaction.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I think that
he wanted devil's advocate counter argument.
I think Carmen's emphasis on how generous he was as a mentor and teacher is a really important thing to re-emphasize in this context, because of the fact that we have focused on what a dramatic and sort of engaged and sometimes combative and controversial figure he was. He was an incredibly generous teacher and had all the time in the world for anyone who would come and talk to him, which you did even more than I did, and I did. And it could go wherever you wanted to take it. And while you were with him one-on-one, he had nothing else to be doing except focus on the things that were important in that moment. And then as a teacher, his default mode was to go systematically through his list of issues and put things up on the wall and then ask for everyone's observations or views, whatever they may be, and then exhaustively, one by one, to go through them and see what they came to or why they were that way. And for every student who raised a question, he gave an answer. For every student who challenged him and pushed him, his typical mode was either to correct the student, or if he couldn't correct them in the moment, he would come back the next day or the next session, either armed with further information, as with Alex's reference to, explaining that hand in the Leonardo, or else he would also, once in a while, it was a rare thing, say, "You're right. That's a better way of thinking about this." And if you brought to him an idea that you were having that wasn't even fully formed and that didn't necessarily even go anywhere, but was just on your mind. I took an idea to him once about something I had observed in Giotto's representation of the damned in the Arena Chapel, something that wasn't discussed, but that was curious. And he said, "Yeah, that is curious." And for a rather long time after that, he kept coming to me occasionally with sources he had come across and said, "Well, here, this might also feed into that issue." And so he just took his students, even the undergraduates, but certainly, especially the graduates, very seriously. And never talked down. He would talk down to John Pope Hennessy, perhaps, but he never ever talked down to the students unless they were just being impossible to him. And once in a while, a student would come along who wouldn't play the game of having reasons or of reaching for evidence. And then he would take aim at that person and start needling and pushing and probing Socratically until the person either cried uncle or came around or did better. But that itself is a really remarkable and valuable thing for a teacher. He was a wonderful teacher in all these ways.
In seminar, he always, because he gave us a lot of research in progress. So, whether it was the Fra Angelico when he was then later writing the Lex Amoris, or the Michelangelo, or the Donatello, the Santo altar in Padua, the reconstruction, And then he would come in the next time that he had just presented and say, a postscript. And so it was the postscripts were beloved because every single seminar had a postscript the next time, which was so. And he would say that in letters. He would say it about the seminars. It's one of his beloved words.
I think we might need a postscript to today's celebration, actually. I think that's actually a really nice way to close our time together. I would encourage all of you to stay in touch and to stay in touch with us at the museum. We're unfortunately over our time, but I wanted to let you all know that we will have this program available, a recording of it on our website, and you will receive a link to it after that is uploaded.
Mhm.
I want to thank all of our guest speakers and panelists for attending today, for your time. It was such a pleasure to meet each of you and to meet, if you will, Creighton Gilbert through your eyes and stories. We're so honored that you chose to spend the afternoon with us. In particular, Carmen, I think that you're my hero. and thank you for taking your duties off at the Met today to spend the day with us. Creighton Gilbert's legacy lives on in your work. And I dare say we all agree that his taking a chance on you, as you put it, was a profoundly wise decision. Many thanks to you, David, for your enthusiasm and for participating and for your lovely biography, which I hope you will finish and publish. Definitely deserves that. And to Alex, who has been influential on so many Americanists, including myself. So it was a treat to have you on the panel today. Erin, Allison, thank you for your work on the exhibition and for participating today. I would be remiss if I did not thank Eric Lee for fostering a relationship with the museum and Dr. Gilbert, which resulted in his bequest to our museum in 2011. And thank you to the Creighton Gilbert estate, and particularly Stephen Gilbert, who I think was trying to make it today. I'm not sure if he made it, but for funding the conservation of major works in the collection and for donating Creighton's personal papers to the museum. Well, before we sign off, I want to encourage all of you to visit Life in Looking, the Creighton Gilbert collection, which will be on view here in Norman through December 31st. If you're unable to visit in person, you may access the virtual exhibition from our website or from the link posted in the chat window. As I said, a recording of this program will be available soon on our website and YouTube channel. And finally, I want to encourage you to return and join us for the November Coffee with the Collection, which will be on November 19th. That's an informal bi-monthly Zoom program about works in the permanent collection. And Erin and Allison will be back to talk about their favorite works in the Creighton Gilbert collection. You can find out more about Coffee with the Collection or register on our website at fjjma.ou.edu. So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you for panelists for joining us. Be safe, stay well.
Thank you.
And
Thank
we'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Very
Thank you.
interesting. Thank you all. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you.